I do remember this very well, and it was the first TV debates that were held with presidential candidates. And Nixon refused to allow them to put his makeup on. Real men don't wear makeup, you know. Kennedy, the appearance on the TV was one of death and one of vibrance. Kennedy absolutely used technology to sway things the way he wanted it to go. I absolutely remember, well, Kennedy coming on the television and telling us that they had just discovered the Soviets were putting missiles into Cuba. Now, the truth of the matter is I had a friend at Gitmo. Gitmo was not always a prison. Guantanamo base was a foot in the door, if you will, in communist Cuba. And my friend was in the crypto room taking and sending to the White House comm room pictures of all of the Soviet missiles weeks before they just discovered it. And he presented it to the public then. I remember well, of course, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy too. But those were watershed things that technology did. And so I think we really ought to take advantage of the ability to reach out and bring in this generation that has become so, shall we say, technology focused that sometimes that's the only reality they know. So we ought to take advantage of that, and I assume that you're going to be covering that a little bit more tomorrow. But some of those things, in my mind, I saw the technology began to come on the political scene. How many here are happy with the political environment today? Show of hands. No? Okay. I think you're pretty normal people. This is arguably the most corrupted, perverse political environment this nation has ever seen. And I am absolutely ashamed of who is running for president at this time. When I was in the military, my first security clearance, I had to apply for it in January of 1970. And so I've had a security clearance and very high levels of security clearances for many years. And had I done what Hillary Clinton did, I would have been in jail. There is no question about that. Still, yes, I would have probably been there for the rest of my life. And it is absolutely a travesty at the cavalier attitude that is being demonstrated there. And that's just one instance that should absolutely disqualify her to run for president. But honestly, have you ever heard Trump say anything that would indicate he's read the Constitution? Have you ever heard him say anything that would indicate he would keep his actions within the bounds the Constitution establishes? Absolutely not. He's a master at being able to take the collective thought of frustrated Americans and then vocalize them. But that does not mean he thinks of himself as anything less than perhaps an emperor. An elected one, but nonetheless an emperor. And I suspect that that's, well, there's not a lot of other good choices, and we can talk about that after that as to why I'm here. In fact, I'm completely diverged from what I had been asked to come here by Bill. But the fact of the matter is we are in a challenging time. And you need to hold on to that because there's something going on in the United States right now that makes this time perhaps the most dangerous time that has ever existed. It's not politically corrupt and perverse, but it's dangerous. This nation is in greater danger of completely unraveling at this time, far more even, I think, than the 1860s. Some of you may remember some of the events that were going on there. No, I know you weren't there, Rex. But, okay, so, no. But you remember reading about them. And it has to do with something that Bill did mention. He mentioned this idea of a conference of states. And he asked me to come and kind of present something, well actually, I think he kind of wanted the same presentation I did when we did that on Washington Day. But I've modified it a little bit because time marches on and so does the approach of these people that are seeking to bring about a conference of states. And it is a convention to change the United States Constitution. They call them a lot of different things. Convention of States, Conference of States, Article 5 Convention, Amendments Convention. They'll probably come up with other names. Say again? Con, yeah, well, that's what I probably do because there's a lot of con in the con. Okay, but the fact of the matter is, it is all a con. And so I've titled this 10 Delusions of the Conference of States Advocates. And I hope you'll kind of bear with me. I'm trying to present enough information to inoculate you, and you in turn with your friends and family and all you have any contacts with, to this most perverse disease that perhaps is facing the nation at any time in its entire history. Because we are truly in danger of losing our magnificent Constitution. And they will do everything in their power to convince you that's impossible to have happen. But I personally know people that have written entirely new constitutions. And if one of these things does happen, particularly with this one we're going to talk about this evening, because this is something that is highly organized, cleverly disguised, powerfully promoted, and it is being done from coast to coast. In fact, in your state, you just deflected one in your last session of Congress, or your legislature.
Barely.
Barely, yes, barely. And we did too, just barely in Utah. That's not to say that we haven't been so stupid in Utah as to do some other things that are very dangerous, but this thing I'm going to talk about this evening is truly the most dangerous of these resolutions that is coming before our legislatures. So if we can somehow come to understand the emperor has no clothes, despite of what they would have you believe. And if wishes were horses, beggars would ride, but all they have to present to us are wishes that they present as truths. And they are truly delusions. That's why I called them delusions. Well, it's the resolution is called a resolution for calling a convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. It's so powerfully promoted across the entire nation. It's not just in your state or mine. It's based on false pretenses, in fact, delusions. Now I put Noah Webster, one of the founding fathers, definitions of delusion. The act of deluding, deception, a misleading of the mind, false representation, illusion, error, or mistake proceeding from false views. I couldn't have defined it better. That's exactly what they're presenting. Of course, then in 2 Thessalonians, which some people think Paul wrote and other people strongly disagree, so I'm not going to get into that little shiny object to follow right now. But you ought to do your own research on that. There's some really interesting studies on that. He talked about that in our day there'd be strong delusions that were sent among us, that we would believe a lie. And that's what it truly is there are delusions about throughout our nation. Well, here's the pertinent lines out of our resolution. And usually they're a couple of pages long and all of the yada, yada, yada stuff that comes in resolutions in front of the legislature. All of the fluffy kind of stuff and wherefores and herebys and all that kind of stuff. So the legislature of the state of, in your case, Wyoming, hereby applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of a convention of the states, limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and term limits of office for the officials and the members of Congress. Okay? That's what it says. So they propose amendments to do fiscal restraints. And by the way, I might tell you that one of the things they're primarily pushing this for, and I will tell you absolutely unequivocally, that it will have a different presentation in your state than it will in Hawaii. Okay? They sing the song the choir wants to hear. So in your state, fiscal restraints probably, yeah, I'm like that. Those guys are spending our money so fast. What? Oh man, we got to rein those guys in, so on and so on. That isn't an issue in Hawaii. Hawaii wants to get rid of the Second Amendment, and that's the resolution that they're passing. Okay? But here in Wyoming, and by the way, I say I'm glad to be here in Wyoming. I'm pleased to be with you. I think pound for pound, or population for population, I don't know, maybe a pound is a bad analogy, but the fact is, I think Wyoming has some of the most independent-minded, freedom-loving people of all the states per capita. I really do believe that. And in fact, that would be one thing that would encourage me to move here, because I want to be among people that love their liberty. That's one of the most precious commodities in the world. But at any rate, fiscal restraint, what does that mean? A balanced budget, perhaps? Maybe it means some kind of way of spending money and so on. We're going to maybe talk a little bit about that, but not so much because it would take so long. I've got a whole presentation on balanced budgets. But the fact of the matter is, I have read every single balanced budget amendment that has come out. Now, if I missed one, I'm sorry. But I have so many balanced budget amendments I have reviewed, and not a single one of them, not one of them, would balance a budget. It would not. And virtually all of them would make constitutional that which is currently unconstitutional. Because right now, the Congress can only spend money on those things enumerated in the Constitution. It's very specific. Here are your powers. Article 1, Section 8. You list that? Okay. Fact of the matter is, they're violating it. But the fact of the matter is that the balanced budget amendments, virtually to the last one, presents it in a manner that says if you've got money, you can spend it. Okay, now think about that for a second. Are there any limits on what you can spend it on? No. If you've got it, you can spend it. Okay? And so it would change this. It would fundamentally change. Who's been trying to do that? I think Mr. Obama's been doing that, hasn't he? It would fundamentally change the structure of this nation from a government with limited powers, with delegated powers within which the national government must operate, to a government that has unlimited powers. Now, this first time there was an attempt made to do this, and it's another shiny object out there that I really hate to follow, but maybe I will for just a second. It was back in 1792. Most of you weren't here, even Rex, okay? But this was made before the United States Congress, and there was an attempt to make that anything that could be in some way associated with welfare, which was never intended to have anything to do with spending of money or doles or anything like that. And if you read the Founding Fathers' definition of welfare, it has to do with stability and predictability. The things that allow a nation to go forward. No civil disobedience, no foreign wars, stable economy in terms of the money can't be corrupted, those kind of things. But there was a movement in February of 1792 to try and take welfare to mean spending of money. And James Madison, the father of the Constitution, got up and eloquently and powerfully spoke on the floor of the House about how it never meant that, and if it ever does come to mean that, we will destroy the nation. There you have it. It's been a long time. More than 200 years that they've been trying to do this. But these fiscal restraint things, really, truly, that they're claiming do not have anything to do with it. Why are they claiming that right now? There are people that say there's more Republican legislators right now than there are Democrats. And Republicans are always better fiscal handlers, right? We need to talk. Okay, but just a minute. They say states balance their budgets. National government ought to have to do that too. And Republicans can help them do that. Let me tell you, none of the states balance their budgets. They don't. Virtually every state takes anywhere between 15% and 50% of their state operating funds from the national government. My state takes just about 31% of its annual budget from the federal government. If we really were, quote unquote, as they claim, the best managed state in the nation, do you think we'd be needing to take a handout from the federal government to almost 1/3 of our annual budget? No. And none of our Republican legislators are willing to say, no, we're going to stand on our own 2 feet. We are going to be independent of you guys. Okay, now if we got a balanced budget and it said you're going to have fiscal restraint, how many of the states do you think will say, cool, I can give up 1/3 of my budget? You think? What's going to happen is they're going to increase taxes to balance the budget, because the states are going to continue to insist that they take this lion's share of their, whatever they deserve, with the goodie box. And it's not going to happen. We, the people, will bear it on our backs, and if we don't, our grandchildren will. Okay? Well, I've spent too much time on fiscal restraints, but they believe, and by the way, the other thing they do is they pull this shenanigan called bonds. what's the root word of a bond? Bondage, isn't it? Okay? And a bond is an instrument of debt. And what they do is they pledge future revenues to the payment of that debt. And in my state, you know, it's anywhere from $10 to $100 million usually every year that they bond for. But they're balanced in their budget because they pledged future revenues that your grandchildren may be paying off. Okay? But it's still an instrument of debt. And so they claim they're balancing the budget, but all they've done is pledged future revenues. Think about it. If you pledge enough of the future revenues, what happens? You run out of future revenues, don't you, in terms of what's available? So what do you do to take care of that problem? You increase taxes, folks. Okay, so this is a facade, this is a delusion. I've spent more time on this than I should have, but the fact of the matter is, fiscal restraints are an absolute delusion. And I won't spend a lot more time on it. Limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. I'm going to spend a lot more time on that. But that's what they're proposing amendments for. And they want to limit the terms of office for those that are already in office. We'll spend some more time on that, so I'm not going to at this moment. So, they're making a lot of false claims to promote this dangerous resolution. And it is arguably the most dangerous resolution that's ever been brought forth through the state, and I hope by the time we get done, you'll agree that everything in the United States Constitution is on the table with this. There is nothing that could arguably be left out. If they can change it according to what they're writing this for, nothing is hands off. And they're going to try and spin it in such a way they'll say, oh no, you can't. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. Fact of the matter is, there isn't a limit at all. Okay? Puts all the entire Constitution open to revision. It proposed that if it's convened, I say there's no limits or bounds in the power granted to modify the Constitution. By definition, a Constitution establishes the power and jurisdiction of the government. By definition. If it's going to change the power and jurisdiction of the government, so what does that mean? You're going to change the Constitution. So seeking to change the Constitution with the intention of limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government basically is tantamount to opening the entire Constitution to revision or replacement. It really, truly is. Think of any part of the Constitution that could not be changed with that charge. So I'll remind you now and then maybe later on too that the original Constitution Convention of 1787 was called by Congress to those representatives of the states to revise the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. To revise it. Revise, if you look it up in Webster's original dictionary, means to amend. So they were charged to amend the existing Constitution. What did they do? They set it aside and wrote a whole new one.
On the way.
Yeah, they wrote a brand new one in 1787. Like I say, I personally know people that have written a new Constitution that they want to have this nation adopt. And as I read through some of those, when I've got them from them, I say, oh, I see what they're trying to do here. Oh, my goodness, look what they're trying to do here. Oh, how can we, You know, and then, of course, you know, you start reading it more carefully and you realize that they have fundamentally changed every aspect of the United States. Things that we cherish. Things that you would like to, I believe, pass on to your grandchildren. And the things that we will not be allowed to. Some create a whole new form of an oligarchy that they have in the government. Okay, so I usually go testify against these things when they come before the Utah legislature. And by the way, I've spoken about these subjects from Florida to Alaska, all over the country. And I've had debates with those that are promoting them. I've had presentations on radio programs and videos that we've done. And it's been something that has been, I've heard their arguments from Florida to Alaska. And they have these facades that they present. And so during a committee hearing on this particular resolution that I'm talking about this evening, one of the committee members, very astutely, he's a member of the legislature, he said to the people that were proposing it, what are the limits of this aspect of the proposed Constitution? You know, if you're going to change the jurisdiction of power of the Constitution with that open-ended statement, what are the limits that are on this right now? And Utah Representative Ken Ivory, he's the guy that nationwide, he is promoting this probably single-handed more than anybody else in the whole nation. And he has called in to different states to promote this in their legislatures. So there's his picture. If you see him wandering the halls of your Congress, just be aware that you're at grave risk, because he is promoting it probably more vigorously than almost anybody can imagine. But here's what he said to that astute question: what are the limits? He said, this is a direct quote, "The limits the convention places upon itself." I was sitting there by him when he said that. Huh? That's what he said. Huh? I'm going to write another book someday, and it's going to have to be an audio book, because you can't say, huh? Unless it's an audio book. Because you can't just write, huh? Really, and have it have the effect. But anyway, huh? The limits they place on themselves? That's pretty open-ended. Mighty risky, isn't it? What did the first convention do?
Totally changed it.
They didn't rewrite it. They wrote a new one. A brand new one. Brand new. And I'm so thankful that the men that were there were the honorable, noble men that they were. And even at that, they had so many challenges to get it done. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute about who will be there this time. Some of mine, I imagine. Okay, so it kind of sounds like what Nancy Pelosi said about the health care bill. You have to pass it to see what's in it. Trust me, folks, it's going to be great. The more we learn about the health care bill, the more we're disappointed in it, aren't we? Okay, yeah. But they passed it without knowing what was in it. Kind of like the Patriot Act. I'm one of the few people in the entire nation that has read the entire Patriot Act cover to cover, top to bottom, underlined it, cross-referenced it, annotated it, and reviewed it, and then testified before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee on a hearing to renew the Patriot Act back in April of 2004. What a dog and pony show that was. And I was so angry by the time I got done. I thought I was going to be accused and imprisoned because of contempt for the Senate. But I did have contempt for the Senate. But the fact of the matter is, if you really know what's in these things, you would be utterly shocked. But anyway, Nancy with the health care, okay? And maybe it's kind of like change you can believe in. How's that working out for you guys? You know, you saw how Obama got, you know, in my undergraduate work, my undergraduate focus is in political science, my master's degree is in public administration, my PhD is in constitutional law. But in my undergraduate work, I took a class, I don't remember the exact name of it, it was something like political language, or language of politics, I think is what it was. And there is actually a science behind the euphemistic terms that are used when things are presented to the public. See, when he said change, well, maybe you thought, oh, darn well, we've got to have that change. We're going to return to the Constitution. Somebody else thought, hey, I'm going to do a new cell phone. I mean, you know, everybody hears and interpolates what they want with that. And that's why euphemistic terms are used. We're going to make this nation great again. Who said that? Come on, Trump, you just heard it. Okay? What does that mean? Anyway, don't get me off on that shiny object. But the fact of the matter is that they use euphemistic terms that we interpret the way we want to, and therefore and we need to understand what's underlying it. And that's like this power thing. So, what Ivory said, limit the convention places upon itself, is reminiscent of what the power granted in the National Socialistic Organization book in 1940 said. Who were the National Socialists? Nazis. See, they didn't call themselves Nazis, though. They called themselves National Socialists, National Socialists, National Socialists. Say it long enough, fast enough, it turns into Nazi. Okay? That's how we contracted it. Okay? So, here's what it said in that 1940 handbook. The power of the leader is not limited by checks and controls, by special autonomous bodies or individual rights, but is free and independent, all-inclusive and unlimited. He is responsible only to his conscience and to the people. And we all know how happily ever after that went. Okay? With the convention coming together to do whatever they want to do, and by only the limits that they decide to put on themselves, we could have one of those kind of happily ever after stories again. Okay? It's really a high risk. Mark Meckler is another guy you may see walking the halls of your legislature. He usually pals around with Ken Ivory. He was brought in by Ken Ivory into Utah to be his expert witness because Ken Ivory's a member of the legislature, and so he wanted somebody from the outside to tell them what the deal was. Well, this legislator that was astute enough to say, what are the limits? And Meckler answered it this way, because the guy was pushing him for some specificity. You need to say, this is what it's about, because I've been saying that. If you leave this open-ended, you don't know where it's going to go. And you can't trust that they're going, and you're going to see what he said here means you absolutely cannot trust what the Hawaii delegate is going to read into that. Because Hawaii legislature passed a resolution for a Constitutional Convention, whatever you want to call it, that would remove the Second Amendment. How's that going to fly in Wyoming? Okay? See, Wyoming may just suddenly secede. I don't know what Wyoming's going to do, because like I say, you guys are independence-minded people and love to be free. But here's what Meckler said when he was pushed for specificity. He said, no more specificity is possible because tying it down too tightly would prevent other state legislatures from being so bold as to bring a call for a convention that might be counted with this one to meet the 2/3 constitutional requirement for Congress to convene a convention if it did not meet their view of what ought to be addressed in the convention. See, they want that open-endedness. They want that euphemistic, oh, I know, we're going to get a balanced budget amendment out of this, or whatever. But again, in Hawaii, they don't want a balanced budget amendment. And I'm just using them as an example, and there's dozens, literally hundreds of other examples we could use, but since I've used it, I'll just stay with that one without having to explain the other ones. He says we can't make it more specific, because other legislatures will then say, oh no, our legislature doesn't want that. We want this. You see how that works? Okay. So, it opens it up to a vast spectrum of potential reasons that a convention might be called. They really want that. They want it open to everybody to say, I want one of these conventions for me. Okay? Now, there's some of the recently proposed amendments that I've put up here to eliminate the Second Amendment. Truly, that is one of them that's been suggested. How about eliminating the Electoral College? And that's another shiny object I'd love to come back and talk to you about, is why we don't want to do that. It has to do with separation and division of powers, even sources of powers. And we all know how the 17th Amendment was fouled up this nation. This is another step in the same direction of the 17th Amendment. But anyway, they want to constitutionally, some do, want to constitutionally protect their right to kill your baby before it gets born. Okay? And some want to constitutionally mandate, incorporate by reference into the United States Constitution so it could never be undone, the Obamacare legislation. Well, I just had room for 4 there, but there's been 11,535 other amendments that have been proposed since the beginning of this nation. Okay, so any one of those could be brought forth too. Anyone, or all of them, or none of them, or a whole new rewrite. Okay. Well, some of us, most of us probably in this room, understand that the Constitution already does this wonderful, amazing, magnificent job of defining and restraining the powers of the national government. And it's very specific. The 10th Amendment says, if we didn't give it to you, you don't have it. Those powers are reserved to the states or the people. Read the 10th Amendment again sometime. I know most of you are far more conversant about that than the vast majority of Americans. But the fact of the matter is, it says if we didn't give it to you, national government, you do not have it. And you need to remember that the national government, every single office in the national government is a creature of the contract. They were created by the contract called the Constitution. They do not have autonomous, standalone authority to change the contract. Supreme Court justices don't any more than the President does, or any member of Congress, or anybody. Who are the parties to the contract? The states. They were the ones that agreed to delegate to the national government a certain set of powers. And if the national government begins to abuse those powers, so if they've got a delegated power and they begin to abuse them, oh, this is another shiny object. 2 more hours, right? So anyway, if they begin to abuse those powers, Jefferson said, and Madison agreed, that the constitutional authority to correct that is in the ballot box. So if you have a delegated power to establish tariffs, Let's just take the thing that happened in 1828 with South Carolina. The United States Constitution delegates to the national government the authority to establish tariffs. Well, South Carolina took umbrage at the fact that these tariffs were established in overreach. And they said, we're going to nullify it. Well, in 1834, James Madison wrote notes on nullification. And many people that are against nullification and try to say it's the father of the Constitution doesn't believe in this, so how can you? Well, if you read them carefully, you'll find that Madison said South Carolina could not nullify, and there's a whole process that they said they could nullify under. South Carolina could not nullify because that power was delegated to the national government to establish tariffs. So since it's something they're abusing, a delegated power, you've got to fix it at the ballot box. But on the other hand, if they had usurped a power not delegated, the people of the states have the power and authority, the right and the responsibility to nullify it. And there's a process by which that happens. But people will say James Madison didn't believe in nullification, but they haven't read carefully his 1834 notes on nullification or Jefferson's writings on it. But the fact of the matter is, the national government's powers are hardly limited. And they can't go beyond those powers. Okay? Problem is that people are out there constantly violating their oath of office. And we, the people, encourage it. We're complicit to it. We're complacent. One thing about apathy, who cares? Okay? The people just don't. And I got to tell you, I've run for the United States Senate twice. Lost both times, two-time loser. Okay, so, anyway, fact of the matter is, I had people contacting me that would say, if I vote for you, what will you give me? They were that overt about it. They wanted something out of the goodie box. We won't go into how I responded to that, but the fact of the matter is that's what the people are doing, selling their votes. Okay, so putting the Constitution at risk by opening it to the likes of those that are currently violating it, it's the height of lunacy. It's complete buffoonery to think the people that are currently out there, I don't care if they're in your state legislature, if they're accepting federal dollars into you, and I assure you they are, into your budget in your state, they're violating their oath of office. Because the Constitution does not allow a redistribution of wealth of any kind. The power to tax, Judge Roberts said, oh, well, the power to tax is granted in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. So we can tax anything we want. And so it's okay to have Obamacare. And James Madison was very specific about that, that power can only be exercised on behalf of the powers delegated. Okay? But Roberts took that, and under that logic, they could say, well, we can tax how many children you have, or what color shoelaces you wear, or if you have a picket fence or chain link fence. I mean, they could tax anything. What would be immune to that? But the real logic is they can only tax for the purposes that they've been established to exercise power. So, those guys at the national government are doing it, us guys at our state legislatures are doing it, and the guys that are in the streets and highways and byways are asking for those. I don't care whether it's cash for clunkers, food stamps, farm subsidies, who are not gored so far? Pell Grants for schools, not a one of those is allowed constitutionally. Every single one of them violates the United States Constitution. And that's how people sell their votes. Hey, I got college education because by the way, I never borrowed a nickel. You can hear these kids that bachelor's, master's, and doctoral never borrow a nickel. The kids now come out with bachelor's degrees and they owe $50,000. What are they thinking? You know? Anyway, that's another strength object. Okay, so they try to use a lot of delusional thought to put aside the fears of some of these legislators that are thinking. There are 10 of these I wanted to briefly touch upon, and I'm going to have to speak quickly. Assertion 1, or delusion 1, however you want to put it, is that Article 5 of the Constitution allows the states to call a convention of the states to modify the Constitution. I am astonished at how many people that run for office or hold office, when I bring to their attention, you know, the word convention of states don't even appear in the Constitution. Oh, yes, they do when they get their Constitution out, if they happen to be carrying one. I've got one here in case you want to look at it. They flip to Article 5. It's not there. They've never read it before. Okay, with the critical thought in mind. Okay, no. They aren't even in there in the Constitution. It's a fabrication of those that want to do this because they want to facilitate this deception that the states have all power in this matter. Conference of States, we're in charge. We're going to find out they're not really. Okay, so Article 5 says that the states apply for a convention, not call a convention to modify the Constitution. They apply, but they do not call. Here's the words. The actual wording out of Article 5, Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. Congress shall call. And we're going to find that is absolutely critical to some of these other arguments that they have too. Because Congress's power on this is not limited to that, just the call. I'll tell you why in a minute. So the states apply, Congress calls. It's unequivocally mentioned in the Constitution. Assertion 2, or delusion 2, however you want to put it. Congress has no power in the matter once the states call the convention. Okay? As we talked about earlier, Article 5 says that the Constitution, that the Congress calls the Constitution Convention once the required numbers of states. By the way, how many states is that? 32. Okay, once 2/3 of the states apply, Congress shall call. Okay, so Congress calls the convention. Okay, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Many people today that are trying to usurp power and give the quote-unquote living constitution concept call that the elastic clause. Now you're going to read in a minute here that the elastic clause does not grant additional power to the Congress, only the power to carry out the powers that have been delegated. Okay, now let's talk for just a second. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Congress shall have power to coin money. Doesn't talk anything about building a building, hiring people, setting their parameters, establishing the percentages of each one of the precious metals in there, anything like that. But because of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, and they have the power to coin money, that means they have the power to carry out that power and all things associated with that. And in the Coinage Act of 1792, that's exactly what Congress did. They carried out the power to coin money by doing all those things and others. By the way, they put the death penalty in there for anybody that debauched the value of money. Wonder how that would apply today. Anyway, another shiny object, just to think about. That's how seriously they took the concept of keeping the money stable, real. And that's how welfare was to be carried out. So people could have a predictable, stable future without inflation, for example. Okay. So, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 gives them the power to carry out the power delegated to it. Here's what it says, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Remember, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 through 17. Okay? So those foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So Congress has the power to not only coin money, do all the things we talked about. We're going to find out if they call a convention, they've got powers to really establish a lot of things that have to do with that convention. Carry out all that's necessary to do that convention, according to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes.
I mean, okay. I figured you guys would grasp that a lot faster than a lot of the public educated kids today. Anyway, another shiny object. Okay, now Congress is not going to give that power to the states. They're not going to just say, okay, you guys, go do what you want. No, that's their power. That is their power. They're not just going to say, fine, go ahead. Okay? Now, there's an organization called the Congressional Research Service. It's the official think tank of the Congress. It's a kind of a apolitical, if you will, much you can get in Washington, D.C. It's nonpartisan, and they have people from all walks of life in terms of their intellectual stuff that they bring to that, and Congress takes issues that they need to have studied to them. By the way, one time I was testifying in a House committee in regards to something, and I brought up these two papers that were written by the Congressional Research Service. As you can see, they're pretty substantial papers. And they define their view constitutionally of what Congress will do in the event of a convention. Okay? And the chair of the committee said, well, you know, we have people that try and tell us all the time what to do, and we do what we want. Really? Doesn't the Constitution limit your bounds either? Anyway, some of the exchanges we have in front of these committees are somewhat shameful. But the fact of the matter is, they said, well, since you brought it up, we want copies of it. So they sent one of their staff assistants down to the table where I was testifying from, and he told me he'd take them and bring me back the copy, the originals, and he would take them and give them to everybody. And he whispered to me, as he's getting these things from me, he whispers to me, he says, you know, I used to work for the Congressional Research Service. He says they're real. Congress listens to them because they are the experts, and the Congress knows they're not. He says, they took our advice. I said, thank you very much. Why don't you tell the guys up front? You know, it's kind of... Anyway, these guys are real. A year and a half ago, when I was back in Congress trying to get in every senator office and every congressman's office, I had an opportunity to talk with one member of this Congressional Research Service. They're pretty good people, pretty smart. Okay, so anyway, this think tank comes up with these reports. Back in July and in April, the dates shown there, they published these details about what the duty of Congress is in the matter of congressional conventions. And in those those reviews, they said Congress has this authority and will not acquiesce it. They will not give it away. Congress is not going to just hand this off. Okay, so delusion 3. States may collude, get together and plot and plan among themselves with prior agreement, compact, or arrangement to call a convention for their own purposes according to their prior discussions, and thereafter call a convention by the Article 5 application process that supersedes and supplants the congressional prerogative and power of the matter. They believe that they can get together in advance of this thing and actually say, and by the way, they have been doing this on a regular basis. In November, they did it again in Utah. They came and sat in our House of Representatives, and they had a meeting, a phony baloney meeting, that said, this is how we're going to do this, and this is what they agreed. It's very interesting. Well, the fact is that the Constitution prevents this, unless they have prior consent by the Congress. Here's Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. So if Congress didn't agree to that in advance, they're acting unconstitutionally. And Congress hasn't given that prior agreement, and they won't. And this Congressional Research Service's things point that out. Okay, so if they've been going on, fostering things, these Convention of the States people should be recognized that they're absolutely violating the Constitution when they do that. This delusion 4. Once they've called the convention, they will be in complete charge of the rules of engagement. That includes calling of delegates, number of delegates, one state, one vote, control of the matters and the issues which the delegates may vote, etc. Again, in those referred to studies, they review these things in detail, and they conclude otherwise. Congress has these in their hands. And this Convention of the States people are claiming the authority to go do with what they want, when they want, and how they want. Okay, here's what they said. Congress will exercise their constitutionally mandated prerogative in these following matters. Location of the convention, dates of the convention, delegate count allotment to the states, state vote allocation arranged by how they're going to do it by states, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute. The protection of the delegates from punitive action. We'll talk about what the states think they can do to keep their delegates in line, okay? And how the states are going to prevent them from going rogue on them, okay? Well, a lot of other things are talked about too. We don't have time to even touch on them. Well, Congress is going to exercise their constitutionally mandated prerogatives on this matter. They're not going to leave it in the hands of the states, according to the views in those studies that I've just talked to you about. So let's talk about the voting on the proposed changes to the Constitution. This Convention of the States or Conference of the States or whatever they're calling it say it's going to be done on one vote, one state. Okay? That's the way the original one was done in 1787. That's the kind of the example they're going by. Okay? Here's something we can look at in Wyoming, and you guys will understand it probably better than a lot of people. California has over 38 million people. Wyoming has less than 600,000. That's another good reason to move here. Okay? One of the truisms that I found is the higher the population density, the higher the socialistic propensity in a given area, whether it's a city, a county, a state. But at any rate, so if it was one state, one vote, Wyoming, each resident of Wyoming would be represented by 63 times more power and influence than the individual residents of the state of California. How do you think Boxer and Feinstein and Brown and all those guys are going to feel about that? What are they going to say?
No.
They're going to go through the roof over that. Okay? They're going to want equal representation, aren't they? And you guys in Wyoming are going to have, each one of you is going to have 63 more times power in this thing than each one of the California. Don't you think somebody's going to pick up on that? Okay, anyway. So, these studies I've talked about said that they're going to probably, at the very least, go to an electoral college formula. Under that formula, California would have 55 votes, Wyoming 3, Utah 6, South Dakota 3, and so on. Okay? All right. So what does that do? Let me just ask you, under the last two electoral counts that were done in 2008, 2012, who won the presidency? Come on. You guys know. Okay. Yeah, I know. It makes you kind of... We just had dinner, don't we? Okay. So the fact of the matter is, if it goes to that, the states that have the higher population density are the ones that gave the election to the guy that wanted to fundamentally change the Constitution. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that concern you? Do you think Wyoming is going to have a big voice there? Let me tell you another point. They have discovered in these studies that slightly biases the counts of votes in favor of the smaller states. Because everybody, regardless of size, you have how many senators? Two. How many does California have? Two. So, it slightly biases in favor of the smaller states. Slightly. But nonetheless, it is a bias. And they suggest that perhaps they need to realign the voting based upon population allotment only, not the electoral college thing. So if that happens, smaller states like Wyoming, you've diminished to almost zero influence on that. Almost zero. But they keep telling you it's one state, one vote, because you guys want to hear that. Well, good grief, we're going to be able to have our foot in the door. We're going to be able to get our word in. Congressional Research Services ain't going to happen. Okay? Okay, now, because of our democracy-prone stuff, very likely they'll go with the population-based rather than anything else. Okay? Delusion 6. Okay, the delegates can be kept in absolute control of the states. The states are going to be able to say to those guys, oh, let me just tell you something. What happened in the original Constitution Convention of 1787? Delaware was given specific instructions that if the convention attempted to do anything other than amend the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, they were to pack up and come home. Free, clear, simple. Do it. If you've looked at your Constitution, you'll find that Delaware signed the new Constitution. The very first week in May of 1787 that they were met, they decided to set aside that Constitution and write a new one. Delaware stayed. They'd been given other instructions. The instructions from the Congress to that convention said you're going to revise, meaning amend, the existing Constitution. They overstepped their bounds. Unfortunately, again, they were very, very, very noble, freedom-loving people. So anyway, they're saying now we're going to be able to keep our delegates in control. Okay, so how are they going to do this? They do it with voting instructions. You will go and you will vote on this, blah, blah. Okay, they'll recall their delegates if they have to. Now, by the way, Utah last year passed a resolution that says, you know what, if this thing starts to veer off the tracks in any way, shape, or form, you're supposed to come home. Kind of like Delaware got the instructions. Okay, so let me think about this for a second. Remember Colombo? He always asked these stupid questions. Okay, so we helped get the convention started, Utah I'm talking about, and now the convention's going out into left field. Let's bring our delegates home so that Utah doesn't have any more say about where it's going. Do you think the convention will fold? No. They'll go on with the left field guys, won't they? And they think that's a protection. They passed it last legislative session in 2015. Anyway. Criminal penalties are sometimes predefined by the states. They include misdemeanors, felonies, fines, prison terms even. If you violate this, you're going to jail, buddy. So you toe the line. Well, these studies that I just have been harping on all evening, they say that when Congress calls a convention, they need to protect the delegates from these kinds of actions by their states. And they conclude that Article 1, Section 6, Clause 1 of the Constitution, which protects the Congress from having charges drawn against them back home or for anything else. See, the king used to do this in England. If they were going to have a vote on something that the king was particularly interested in and he figured you were going to vote the way he didn't want you to, he'd arrest you on the way to Parliament. So the members of the convention said, we can't let that happen. These guys can't be imposed upon in any way, shape, or form for what's going on in there. They're legally held harmless. Okay? Do you remember Patrick Kennedy when he crashed his car when he was under the influence? Remember a couple of years ago? This was, I don't remember, 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that. The police show up and he gets staggering out of his car and he says, I'm on my way to the Congress to vote. Was he? No. But he told the officers he was. They couldn't arrest him. Because you cannot, well, we'll read it here. This is what it says, Article 1, Section 6, Clause 1. They, meaning the Congress, shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace. Does drunk driving fall under that? No. He's free and clear. Be privileged from arrest during their attendance in the session of the respective houses and going to and returning from the same. And for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in another place. So Patrick Kennedy knew that if he had the defense that he was going to vote, they couldn't detain him. Okay? That's how it works. It's the way it is. So, this is what the convention proposals that have been put in these reports say should happen for the delegates that go there. They'll be held harmless. Okay, now, if they couldn't be an autonomous body. By definition, a convention like that is an autonomous body. They can go whatever way they want, like in 1787 they did. Okay? So, and if they didn't work out that way, do you think a pardon may be offered to them by the president or the governors? It's possible. Anyway, we can talk about that. They're delusion 7. They say, and this happened in one of the things I testified about this last session in our House of Representatives. They say that this open-ended everything that they're offering there would not allow a change to the ratification process. See, my argument always is the first convention, and only one that's analogous to this, that was ever held, in spite of what they tried to tell you, the first and only analogous one that happened in 1787, where they set aside the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation required all the states, 100% of them, to agree to any changes. That was written into the Constitution of their day. What did they do? They wrote a new one, and then they changed the ratification process. Without any prior consent of anybody. Not Congress, not the states, not the people, nobody. They wrote in a new ratification process. And one of the big things that these Convention of States people talk about is, no, they couldn't possibly change that. And they had the audacity to use an example, because we've been fighting them on this thing. In this last thing that we had in the committee that I testified in on this thing, the Supreme Court ruled in an extension where there was an effort to extend the Equal Rights Bill, the Equal Rights Amendment, ratification process from 7 years to 10 years, that was in the original enabling legislation, where the agreement had been made that they would put this out there for the people for 7 years to ratify, and if they did not, it would die. There was an attempt to expand it to 10 years, and the Supreme Court said no, the enabling legislation on this said 7 years, and so we're going to stick with that. And they're saying, see, you can't change the ratification limits. What? They used a completely apples to oranges kind of comparison. There was legislation that was created with this Equal Rights Amendment that said 7 years, and they're saying, no, you can't just arbitrarily and unilaterally decide now it's 10. Okay? So they say, see, that proves that they couldn't change how we ratify a constitutional amendment. I got news for you. It's completely unrelated. And if any, think about this for a second, a fifth grader can understand this. If any part of the Constitution can be modified during a convention by amendment, all the parts could be. Could they not? If they had the authority to change anything, they'd have the authority to change everything, if it was so given, particularly with the wording that's out there. Okay? So anything and everything would be vulnerable to change, including ratification. Maybe they'll do it with us dipping our finger in a purple thing and saying, I voted. Maybe they'll do it on text messaging. Maybe they'll do it with the majority of the states, 26 states agreeing. Maybe they would do it with the majority of Congress. Maybe they'd do it with the Supreme Court blessing it. I don't know. None of us know. But those are just a few of the things you might want to think about. Okay, so we talked about most of the stuff on this. They wrote a new constitution, everything back in 1787. It's the only truly similar convention that's ever been held, and yet they refuse to admit that the same thing could happen in modern times. Let's look at stop calling delusions or lies. Term limits are proposed in this proposal. It's necessary because we keep re-electing these guys time after time after time. We've got to stop that. Okay, do we need term limits? No. Why? We already have term limits. It's called the ballot box. Every November election, we could remove all of our House of Representatives members, all of them, all 435. We could remove 1/3 of our senators. 2 years later, we could do the same thing in the House and remove another third of our senators, and during that same period, we could remove the president. Couldn't we? We have the power to do that, okay? The electorate is caught up in this incumbent mentality. See, it's our fault. It's, maybe not you guys, but the electorate in the United States are at fault, okay? They're reassured if you run for election. Okay, we get the kind of government we deserve. So, we got this apathetic electorate, we've got this entitlement mentality. The electorate sells their votes, as we've talked about, and whoever offers the biggest goodie box, they get it. Okay, so think about term-limiting office holders. Are we going to get sounder, better founded representatives by doing that? Okay, my position is, and I can demonstrate this by looking case by case if you want. There's always another socialist waiting in the wings to step into a vacant office. There's always another one. And sadly, I've yet to be proven. Well, okay, Amendment 22 limited the terms for the President of the United States. Have we got a higher quality president out of that? Ever? No, we haven't. What about lame duck disasters that are out there? Think about it. We get a lame duck session of Congress every time from the election day in November until the new Congress gets put into office in January. So for 2 months, we're sitting there wringing our hands, fretting about the fact, what are these turkeys or ducks going to do? In this last 6 years, they'd be a lame duck. Think about that. Instead of 2 months, now you got to worry about 6 years. And there's no control on it from the electorate. None whatsoever. Because they already violate their oath of office. You would think that they'd have the honor to uphold that. Okay, so they could do untold damage. And we need to understand that every time you have an election, 1/3 of the senators will be thrown into that lame duck status. That's a bunch. I give you an example, a number of examples, I guess, if we had the time, about some of the things that some of these individuals that have been removed from office during the election process but still hold office, and how bad that is. Okay, what about the Supreme Court? They're even talking about limiting them to 12 years. And they do them on a staggered basis like we do the senators. Think about this for a second. What a plum the Supreme Court is right now. Look at what's happening right now. The wrestling match that we've got going on. The president wants to put in his turkey, and the senators are saying, we want to have another turkey put a turkey in. Okay? And the real problem is, The people falsely believe that the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is. I was in a meeting the other day with a Utah State Senator. He says every time the Supreme Court meets, we have a sitting Constitution Convention. Because the Supreme Court says what the Constitution is, and it is that. Oh, by the way, this guy's a lawyer, too, so he has pretty high regard for his priestcraft. And by the way, the founders coined that term, where people do things for their own aggrandizement and for their own purposes, their own agendas and everything else like that. Founding fathers used that term. It's interesting. Okay, so with term limits, would we want to forcibly remove representatives that are upholding their oath of office? Who in their right mind would term limit James Madison out of the House? Here's the guy that on the floor of the House in February of 1792 got up and defended limited government against these spending things that they were trying to twist it into for the welfare clause. Think about that. What we need is to get an electorate that understands what the oath of office is, what the Constitution means, and what we should be putting in there, and have the people abide in that. And the Founding Fathers, by the way, knew about term limits in 1787. They were written into Article 5 of the original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. They had term limits in there. When they wrote the new Constitution, they already had that in front of them. They found that they were unsatisfactory for all the reasons we've just been talking about. They'd had a very unsatisfactory experience with them, so they left them out when they wrote the Constitution. They had it in front of them in their old Article 5. They left them out of the new Constitution on purpose. Okay. We shouldn't be denied our privilege of choosing our own representatives. That's kind of what happened with the 14th Amendment, until the President in 1868 pardoned all the natural leaders of the people of the South. See, they were precluded from being able to put their natural leaders into office. People said, wait a minute, who's going to represent us? Well, it seems like we already crossed that bridge in the pardoning through the 14th Amendment. Well, we should be able to choose our representatives. Assertion 9. They purport to limit the power and jurisdiction through the amendment they propose. Okay, here's what, again, Founding Father Noah Webster said. I'll just read you the underlined part, because I really am out of time. Oh, I have so much good stuff to tell you. Another time, okay. He said, a constitution is paramount to the statutes or laws enacted by the legislatures, limiting and controlling its power. In the United States, the legislature has created the powers designated by the Constitution. That's how they define constitutions. The United States had the very first written constitution. And it's been the model of almost every other constitution, the most copied constitution in the world, the least abided by. And we can talk about why a constitution is so important and why written ones are absolutely important. Because the British, their quote-unquote constitution was an evolving kind of hodgepodge, eclectic kind of cobbled-together kind of thing, acts of parliament, acts of the king, common law, all this kind of stuff. And it was an evolving thing. The Constitution set it up straight. And now we're trying to go back to this evolving, cobbled-together kind of thing. Okay, Constitution today does that exactly. Each one of the powers are spelled out. And the Bill of Rights said that they made an exclamation and a period after that. There's no other powers that are available to the national government. It's paramount to everything else that they do. Nothing's legally allowed to violate that. And now they violate it every whim. So that's their excuse. They want to change the Constitution because they're violating it. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, they're going to try and make some constitutional practices, some practices that are currently unconstitutional, and we're not going to talk about these because there's just no time. But I could point out, for example, some of you may have seen Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments. The vast majority of his proposed amendments make constitutional that which is currently unconstitutional, and we would no longer have the privilege of standing there saying what you're doing is unconstitutional because they make it constitutional. It's astounding to me how people that should know their constitution are throwing it away. Okay, they use a lot of excuses as to why this is happening. In every instance, the real problem is the Constitution being violated. They're tampering and violating with the Constitution, so we've got to change it. That's their excuse. There is nothing the founders ever wrote, in spite of the way that they talk about it. The last time I saw one of the guys, this Ken Arby guy, and his position was that George Washington suggested we should change it. No. He didn't say we should change it if they're violating it. We should hold it sacred. And it should be obligatory upon all until changed by an authentic act of the people. That's how he put it in his farewell address, but we don't talk about that. Violates all logic, reason, and intelligence. The problem's not the Constitution, it's in our representatives that stop the violence. Okay, we've got to return.